Muchísimas gracias. Es un placer ser aquí y un honor con ustedes. Madrid es una de mis ciudades preferidas y me parece siempre que los españoles saben vivir muy, muy bien a pesar de todas las dificultades. We are gathered here tonight at a difficult moment. I really believe that Brexit, the British decision to leave the European Union, a crazy decision in my view, a misguided decision. Britain had lived in great prosperity with a market of 500 million people at its doorstep for more than 40 years and decided to turn its back on that. And that told me that what's going on in the world at the moment at some levels is that people want, or a significant number of people want, disruption at any cost. Brexit was followed by the election of President Donald Trump, and I think we're facing the greatest challenge to the democratic liberal order in my lifetime. We live now in a combustible, uncertain, and unraveling world. And the liberal consensus of only a quarter century ago, when the Berlin Wall came down, and we all assumed that people knew they wanted to live in open, democratic, free societies under the rule of law with free markets, and they didn't want to live under authoritarian systems or totalitarian systems. There was such consensus on that some announced, misguidedly, the end of history. Well, that view, that consensus, has died a very strange and troubling death. Post-truth, as you know, is the Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year, and that's ominous. When the distinction between what is true and what is false, what is real and what is fake, begins to blur, when populations and citizens become disoriented, they are more susceptible to an authoritarian leader. And they may even start to believe that the only truth, the one truth, is the truth that is emanating from the mouth of said leader. And of course, in those circumstances, the future of the liberal democratic order is that it dies. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're not there yet, but nor can we ignore the danger signs. I just came from Munich, from the kind of Davos of foreign policy, the preeminent gathering of foreign policy thinkers and actors. And it was a somewhat surreal occasion. It was certainly the most surreal Munich gathering I'd ever been to. Everybody tried to pretend that all is well. It's not. Mike Pence, my vice president, came to Munich, made a speech in which he said America's commitment to NATO is unwavering, extolled the great achievements of NATO over decades since 1945, and then exited without taking questions and left. Well, of course, I'm a journalist. My first question would have been, Mr. Vice President, you have just extolled NATO, but your boss, the president, says that NATO is obsolete. Well, which is it? This, unfortunately, is the reality we're living with this administration. And Kevin alluded to Alice in Wonderland. We're being dragged down the rabbit hole where 2 + 2 = 5. And you have the two most senior members of the American administration saying diametrically opposite things. This is not serious, and it's dangerous because, as you know, the word of the American president, the word from the White House, has ultimately been what has undergirded the security and the stability of the world since 1945 under Pax Americana. If the word of the American president is junk, then we are all in a more dangerous and more unstable world. Now, President Donald Trump, made clear in his inaugural speech what he stands for. He didn't speak of American values. He didn't speak of liberty, democracy, the rule of law. He didn't speak of any of those things that presidents generally invoke on their first day in office. And perhaps we will now have a 4-year experience in what the United States is when stripped of the American idea. America is an idea. It is indistinguishable from the idea of a nation of immigrants drawn together with shared rights and responsibilities under the rule of law and committed to the spread of freedom, democracy, and openness around the world. Well, perhaps now we will have an experiment in what the United States is stripped of that idea when foreign policy becomes purely mercantilist. What can you give me? If you can't give me enough, I'm not interested in you. That seems to be what the president has been talking about. Well, what does America first, America first, America first, he said it twice, and he said it many times since. What does it actually mean? How threatening is it? I think it is pretty threatening to the liberal order. It's early days. It's only been 1 month. It's been one chaotic month. But this is a president who is opposed to the European Union. He attacks the European Union. When he spoke to Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, on her visit to New York, and when he spoke on the telephone to Mr. Tusk, the European Union President, his first question, according to, I think, reliable sources, was, who's next? Who's next? Who's going to follow Britain out of the European Union? He is hoping that there will be others. So presumably, he is hoping for the election in April or May of Marine Le Pen in France. This is something completely new. Every US administration since 1945 has seen in European unity, growing European unity, a cornerstone of peace and stability on this continent, which of course it is. I was born in 1955. Not a day has gone by since I've had a conscious adult mind that I haven't thanked the European Union for the fact that I didn't do what my father and uncle did. South Africans who joined up with the South African army in Johannesburg. My uncle fought his way all the way across Italy. He was at Monte Cassino. He saw the destruction there and wrote in his diary at the age of 23 that photographs of that destruction should go out for all time to every classroom across the world so that people know what the reality of danger, the reality of war is. And I personally think that we are undergoing at the moment an extraordinary exercise in mass amnesia about the importance and centrality of the European Union. Of course, President Trump has, as far as I can see, no interest in or knowledge of European history. So perhaps it's unsurprising that he seems ready, through his words, to undermine this union. But that is going on. It's happening. We don't know yet, of course, how the balance of forces will play out. We don't know if we should attach any meaning to what Vice President Pence or Defense Secretary Mattis or our phantom Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who never breathes a word, who wasn't at Munich, who doesn't have a spokesman. There hasn't been a State Department briefing. Normally there's a State Department briefing every day. There hasn't been a State Department briefing for more than a month. What is going on? We do not know yet how this administration works. Of course, the president, America first also means, or seems to mean, attacking NATO. The president has said it's obsolete, and he hasn't retracted that statement. He's not in the habit of retracting anything that he says. We are seeing an attack on multilateralism in general. There's not a multilateral organization or agreement that the president seems to like. His first act was to rip up the TPP, which of course Kevin has been very much involved in. And the TPP was not just a trade pact, it was a means for a country like Vietnam to offset Chinese power in Asia. It was a political architecture, just in the same way that NAFTA has enabled Mexico to grow out of authoritarianism into a more open and democratic system. So we're seeing an attack on the multilateralism that I think has been a foundation of our global stability. Perhaps most troublingly, we're seeing an attack on truth itself, the rabbit hole that I mentioned. Every single day, we at the New York Times hear that we are producing fake news, that it's not fake statements coming out of the White House. We are the failing fake news, usually in uppercase letters on his tweets. We are the fake news failing New York Times. It's very dangerous, I think, when you attack institutions. Not that we don't make mistakes, of course we do, but when you attack the New York Times, the Washington Post, pillars of the Republic, and say they are just spewing out fake news, this is, I think, extremely troubling. And I'm sorry, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's man of the shadows, said that the press should just shut its mouth, his words, should shut its mouth. Well, Mr. Bannon, we're not going to do that. The role of the press is simple. It is to hold authority to account without fear or favor. Hold authority to account without fear or favor. Bear witness. We are the fourth estate. We are an important element of the checks and balances that have served the American Republic well since the Constitution was written. And it is very important, it is vitally important, in my view, that journalists continue doing that work today. And we've seen the president also, and this is an element, of course, in the changing nature of our societies that Kevin described so eloquently. He is going straight to Twitter. He has 30 million or so followers. In many ways, he just held a rally in Florida, arriving on Air Force One, going into a big hangar, giving a speech. He's behaving, at the moment at least, more like a leader of a movement than the president of all Americans. And I think in all of this, we are seeing the outlines of quite a dangerous shift from representative democracy to direct democracy. And we're seeing the discrediting of the very organs of our democratic processes that mediate our differences. We're seeing a systematic attack on the press. I've already described that. On the judiciary, the so-called judge, in the president's words, who overrode the travel ban on people arriving from 7 mainly Muslim countries. Attack on the press, on the judiciary, on the Congress. The inaugural speech essentially said, I am with you, the people, against the Congress, your elected representatives who have betrayed you. Have there been problems? Yes. Has there been polarization and paralysis? Yes. But that kind of direct attack in Washington from the president on one of our core institutions, this, I think, is worrying. And we're also seeing the marginalization of the mainstream political parties that, again, mediate our democracy. And then what are you left with? Well, you're left in modern guise through social media with a leader, the leader, at the head of the inflamed masses. Well, we're in Europe. We know what 20th century European history consisted of. I am not comparing the American Republic to the Weimar Republic, but we know when you get that kind of setup, a charismatic, nationalist leader at the head of a mass movement where the institutions of democracy and the liberal order that we're talking about tonight have been systematically undermined, weakened, and the distinction between what is true and false has been systematically broken down. I think we have, at the very least, to be concerned about where that might lead. Now, Kevin talked eloquently again about values, and we're also seeing, I think, an attack emanating from Washington on the values that Europe and the United States have shared. And it seems, and I'm more than happy to be corrected, but it seems that President Trump finds more to like in Vladimir Putin's macho, authoritarian, white, homophobic, xenophobic, Christian-infused credo than in liberty, democracy, free speech, a free press, and the rule of law. Again, I am more than ready to stand corrected. I am more than ready to hear my president speak out clearly in defense of those values. I'm more than ready to hear my president, who's already been asked twice about a rising tide of anti-Semitic incidents and threats in the United States, including the desecration of a Jewish cemetery in the United States of America near St. Louis the other day. I'm more than ready to hear him say in unequivocal terms, these are abhorrent acts. My administration condemns them with complete conviction and will do everything we can in this administration to ensure that such things do not happen again. We have not heard those words. I don't know why we haven't heard them, but we haven't heard them. There is a lot that we haven't heard. Well, the precursor to all this, of course, was Brexit. And I was in London for that, and frankly, after that, I always thought that Donald Trump was quite likely to win, and I was castigated by many of my colleagues when I wrote this, including one fellow columnist who told me after the last debate and after the famous tape had come out, Roger, get it into your head, it's over, it's over. Well, too many people had told me the way the Brexit vote was going to come out for me ever to believe that it was over. There was something going on. Something is going on in our societies, ladies and gentlemen. Something is going on. Something is happening. We have to recognize this. The world we were living in is no longer the world that we are living in. And in Britain, you saw very similar themes to those in the American election, and themes also familiar to anyone who studied nationalist populism. And I remind you of François Mitterrand's famous phrase, le nationalisme, c'est la guerre. Le nationalisme, c'est la guerre. We know that only too well in Europe. Nationalism, taken to its logical conclusion, is war. And so what were these elements in Britain? Well, we saw the exaltation of a mythical past. Britain's greatness before EU meddlers and bureaucrats started getting involved in British life. The great sovereign island nation ruling over the waves. And exactly the same thing in America. Make America great again. Take us back to some Norman Rockwell vision of America, all white America in the 1950s, with everyone smiling and happy and ignoring the demographic reality of the United States, ignoring the rise of China, ignoring the rise of India. No, Donald Trump, the savior, is going to take us back to a Norman Rockwell picture. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it ain't going to happen. And if he really tries, it's going to get very, very ugly. In Britain, too, we had the designation of enemies, which is always a part of nationalist enemies and scapegoats. You don't have nationalist populism without them. In Britain, it was the EU bureaucracy. It was Germany trying to achieve, through other means, what it had failed to achieve between 1939 and 1945. It was immigrants. It was Turkey about to enter the European Union and Turks taking British jobs. And of course, for all that, in the United States, just read Muslims and Mexicans. It was the successful use of flat-out, barefaced lies. The most famous being that, you know, if we get out of the European Union, the £350 million going every week to Brussels would be spent on the National Health Service. Then the day after Brexit, all the politicians say, actually, that's not quite true. It's not going to happen. Sorry. And you see that everywhere these days. Politicians say X, and then the reality turns out to be Y. And a lot of people don't seem to care. And I think that's partly due to the cacophony on our handhelds that, again, Kevin described. And that's where we are. You saw the bypassing of mainstream parties, a very weak Labour Party, a pretty weak Conservative Party through social media-led mass movement. And you saw again what I've described in terms of the vilification of the institutions of our democracies. And just recall that when the Lord Chief Justice and two other judges ruled that Article 50 could only be triggered once there'd been a parliamentary vote, the Daily Mail, which has been the British paper that has led the Brexit charge, screamed on its front page, Enemies of the people, with a picture of the judges. Enemies of the people, the British judiciary. And what has Donald Trump just said about the New York Times? Enemies of the American people. Is the pattern clear enough? Maybe that's where Donald Trump got the idea. And of course, then we saw Nigel Farage joining Donald Trump on the campaign trail. And I heard today that even a 93-year-old leader in Africa was extolling the virtues of Donald Trump. And that, of course, was Robert Mugabe, who made a speech saying how much he liked Trump. Well, look, it's all very well to paint this dark picture, and I hope I'm not overdoing it or depressing you too much. But, you know, we have to understand it, right? That's what journalists do. It's no good decrying it. You know, it's happened. And Donald Trump is a genius. He had the genius to see that something was afoot, something was happening, as I just said, in the United States, and that he, if he found the blunt language, could become the mouthpiece of that anger. And that is what he did. He borrowed the Republican Party the way I might borrow a tuxedo to use for an evening's dinner party, and he crushed the other Republican candidates, and then he pulled off the most extraordinary political exploit in the recent history of the United States and probably the world. It is quite extraordinary what he did, and we have to recognize this. And so why? I mean, I think some of the elements are these. One is precariousness, precariat, this feeling that a lot of people have in our societies that their jobs are precarious. It's not so much not having a job, it's the precariousness of their job, of their existence, this gnawing unease, this precarious feeling. It's the growth, as Kevin mentioned, of inequality, the way globalization in the 21st century has worked inexorably to make the rich richer and leave the rest of society either treading water or losing out completely, as well, of course, as taking jobs often offshore. I think another important element in what these movements have seized on is a sense among many people of impunity, the sense that elites, the rich, the powerful, there's no justice for them. It doesn't apply. Only impunity. They walked away, all the bankers walked away from the financial collapse of 2008. When the Euro crisis hit, of course, it was the French bankers and others who got paid out first. And this sense that the system is rigged. It's rigged against us. It's rigged in favor of this globalized elite who is able to use the system to enrich themselves and to increase their power. And when a day of reckoning comes, there's no reckoning for them. They walk away, we pay the cost. As Kevin said, the loss gets socialized. And I think that's another element in the anger. I think there's also a great sense of cultural alienation among many people, of province versus metropolis, heartland against the coast, nation against the globalists. I think much more than left and right in our societies now, we have to think in terms of the nationalists against the globalists. And to that, in the United States, was added all the cultural alienation in the heartland over the identity politics of the Democratic Party, the gender politics, the race politics. And the only race, if you like, that got left out was white, blue-collar workers in the industrial heartland. Hillary Clinton didn't go to Wisconsin. Donald Trump identified this constituency, and it carried him to victory. A feeling of powerlessness, a feeling of being overwhelmed, a feeling that everything is coming at you, and it's very hard to distinguish what's true, what's false, what's right, what's wrong. I think another element is tribalization. Our societies are getting tribalized. We live in echo chambers. We're driven into these ideological canyons, and there's no way out of them. We go to the websites or the networks that comfort us in the opinions we already hold. I'm a columnist. For me, the greatest achievement is writing something that might actually change somebody's mind, might make them think again. And sometimes I come up with a nice phrase or an idea, and I think, oh, maybe that will. And then I think, no, nobody the people who read this already think like that. They're not going to change their opinion. No Trump supporter is going to read this and think again. And of course, civilized disagreement is a foundation of our societies. And instead of civilized disagreement these days, we have a shouting match, and we're all in our ideological canyons, in our echo chambers, preaching to the choir. And this, I think, is also very troubling, and is a reason why the Brexit phenomenon, the Trump phenomenon, was not fully appreciated before they happened. And finally, I would use just this word bombardment, but I've alluded to that already. We're bombarded, and because we're bombarded, we're disoriented. Well, we've got Dutch, French, and German elections looming. It's a big year in Europe, and is it all lost? Is Marine Le Pen going to win? Is the liberal order inching toward the abyss? I don't think we're there yet, but we have to be very concerned. There are some encouraging signs, and I want to leave you on a more uplifting note. We've seen the courts already in the United States, checks and balances. We've seen the courts override President Trump's absolutely ridiculous, useless executive order about immigration from these 7. There was no reason for it other than to play to his followers in their ideological. There's no evidence that people from these countries have perpetrated any terrorist acts in the United States for a very long time. The press is alive. Stories revealed by the Washington Post and the New York Times about Mike Flynn, Donald Trump's national security advisor, led to his departure. The Fourth Estate, it's important. Lo and behold, we have a couple 100,000 more subscriptions since Donald Trump took office. Young people are waking up and saying, oh my gosh, journalism is actually important. We need some people who can actually find the truth. And if they're going to find the truth, they need salaries to go out there. So maybe we should take out a subscription. I think this, again, is encouraging. On the bestseller list of books in the United States right now, you have George Orwell's 1984, as well as Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. These are not normally on the bestseller list. It suggests that a lot of people are awake, are vigilant, are very concerned. And you have popular protests. And I think in the European Union, I sensed in Munich, and Javier Solana has talked about this very eloquently, I think the European Union is aware that, of course, it must be cordial toward Donald Trump's America, and relations with the United States are critical. But the European Union is also aware that it must stand up for its values. It must stand up for the liberal order, for liberty, for democracy, for a rules-based international order, for the rule of law, for open systems. And I think it's a moment for the European Union. It's a very important moment for the European Union. And I do see stirrings, and I very much hope that this year, rather than the electoral setbacks for the liberal order that many are predicting, that no, as in Austria, in the end, we don't see that. And we see a European awakening and a European pride in that blue and gold flag, which to me is always a very moving symbol. Our societies are going to have to change in ways that take account of the phenomena I just mentioned. We need to address inequality. We need to address failings in our education system. We need to raise media literacy so that people are able to distinguish between what's true and what's not. We need more inclusiveness. And of course, the New York Times, its readership of 1 million people. Facebook these days is 1.9 billion people. 1 million, 1.9 billion. And a lot of people most people, in fact, go to Facebook for their news. Well, Facebook needs editors. It needs good editors. It needs to distinguish between some fake news site run by kids in Macedonia and real news. It needs algorithms that are capable, if possible, of distinguishing between what's true and what's fake. I think that Mark Zuckerberg has a lot to think about beyond that 5,000-word manifesto he put out the other day. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that we all need to be vigilant, and we need to be unbending in the defense of the values that we believe in. And let's face it, those values stand between us and barbarism. And we know on this continent what form barbarism can take. And I'll leave you with the words of Adam Michnik, Polish dissident, who observed that in the life of every honorable man comes a difficult moment when the simple statement that this is black and that is white requires paying a high price. Well, the price that Michnik paid in Soviet-controlled Poland was several years in prison. And I think that every one of us, if it should ever come to that, and I hope it doesn't, must be prepared to do the same. Thank you very much.